Officer, this man should not be allowed here. This hospital
This is a
for
public
us
hospital.
only.
You do not own this place.
Okay, everyone, let's calm down. We're not doing this
Get
here.
out.
Don't touch.
March 15th, 2024. Margaret Thornfield had 3 minutes to live when she started screaming racial slurs at the black doctor trying to save her. Dr. Marcus Williams held the defibrillator paddle steady above her chest. His finger hovered over the charge button. The woman bleeding out on his table had destroyed his family 15 years ago, planted evidence, perjured testimony. His father died in Cook County lockup because of her lies. Now she was calling him boy and demanding a real doctor while her heart flatlined. The other nurses watched Marcus make his choice. Some prayers get answered in the strangest ways. Some debts get paid when you least expect them. Marcus pressed the button. What happened next would haunt Mercy General for decades. Because sometimes justice wears scrubs, and sometimes the person you save is the one who destroyed everything you loved. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret's body jerked against the gurney as 200 joules of electricity coursed through her chest. The monitor shrieked back to life, erratic but beating. Marcus pulled the paddles away, his hands steady despite the tremor he felt deep in his bones. Sinus rhythm restored, called out Nurse Patricia from behind him. BP stabilizing at 90/60. Margaret's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and wild. Blood matted her graying blonde hair where her skull had cracked against the steering wheel. The drunk driver who'd T-boned her sedan at the intersection of Route 47 had walked away without a scratch. Life's sense of irony never ceased to amaze Marcus. Where? Margaret's voice came out as a rasp. Her gaze landed on Marcus's face, and something cold flickered behind her pupils. Even half-conscious and bleeding, she recognized authority when she saw it. 15 years of running a small-town diner hadn't erased the cop instincts. "Ma'am, you're at Mercy General Hospital," Marcus said, his voice professionally neutral. "You've been in a serious accident. We need to get you to surgery immediately. You have internal bleeding and—" "Get away from me." The words came out stronger now, venomous. Margaret tried to sit up, but the restraints held her down. "I want a different doctor. I want someone qualified." Patricia shot Marcus a look. They'd both dealt with difficult patients before, but there was something particularly ugly in Margaret's tone that made the air in Trauma Bay 3 feel thicker. "Mrs. Thornfield," Marcus continued, checking her chart, "I'm Dr. Williams, and I'm the attending physician on duty. Your condition is critical. We don't have time for—" "Know what you people are trying to do." Margaret's voice rose, cutting through the steady beep of machines. "You think I'm stupid? You think I don't know?" The racial slurs came next, each one landing like a physical blow. Marcus felt his jaw tighten, but his hands remained steady as he checked her foreline. 15 years of medical training had taught him to compartmentalize. 15 years of living with his father's ghost had taught him something else entirely. Behind him, he could sense the nursing staff shifting uncomfortably. Patricia, who'd worked with Marcus for 3 years, had never seen him treat a patient with anything less than complete professionalism. But she'd also never seen that particular look in his dark eyes, a calculating stillness that seemed to weigh something invisible. "Ma'am, your spleen is lacerated, and you have a grade 3 liver tear," Marcus said calmly, pulling up her CT scan on the tablet. "If we don't operate in the next 20 minutes, you'll bleed out internally. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" Margaret's laugh was bitter and harsh. "I understand plenty. I know how you people operate. I've seen it before." Her eyes narrowed as she studied his face more intently. Williams. Why does that name sound familiar?" Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. After all these years, could she actually remember? "It's a common name," he said evenly. No. Margaret's voice took on a sing-song quality that made Patricia step closer to the crash cart. "I never forget a name. I never forget a face. It's how I stayed alive all those years working security. Williams." She was getting agitated again, her blood pressure spiking on the monitor. "Mrs. Thornfield, we really need to focus on your medical situation," Marcus said, but his mind was racing. He'd planned for this moment for 3 years, ever since he tracked her down to that pathetic diner in Millbrook. 3 years of careful manipulation, the anonymous tip to the drunk driver's probation officer about missed meetings, the delayed traffic light timing at that specific intersection, even the scheduling that ensured he'd be the attending physician on duty tonight. But he hadn't planned for her to remember his name. Williams, Margaret repeated, her voice growing stronger with each repetition. Thomas Williams, that lying son of a bitch orderly who tried to assault that patient. I made sure he got what was coming to him. She smiled, a cold expression that didn't reach her eyes. And now his boy thinks he's going to get some payback? Is that what this is? The silence in the trauma bay was deafening except for the steady rhythm of the machines keeping Margaret alive. Patricia's eyes went wide as she looked between her colleague and the patient. The other staff members had gone completely still. Marcus stared down at the woman who had destroyed his family, who had sent his father to die in a cell for a crime he didn't commit. The woman who was also, though she didn't know it, the mother of Sarah Thornfield, the brilliant resident in pediatric surgery who'd been sharing Marcus's bed for 8 months, who talked about her estranged mother with such pain that it broke his heart. The irony was so complete it felt like divine intervention. Prep surgery suite 2, Marcus said quietly to Patricia, never taking his eyes off Margaret's face. We're going to save her life. Margaret's paranoid laughter followed them as they wheeled her toward the elevator. The elevator climbed with mechanical precision through the floors of Mercy General, each soft ding marking another second closer to the moment Marcus would hold Margaret Thornfield's life in his hands. Her laughter had finally subsided into the rhythmic wheeze of someone fighting both sedation and the weight of her own paranoia. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across her bruised face, making her look older than her 58 years. Patricia stood beside the gurney, monitoring Margaret's vitals with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent 15 years in trauma care. But Marcus could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers gripped the four-pole just a little too tightly. The accusation still hung in the air between them like smoke from a fire that wouldn't quite die out. Marcus, Patricia said quietly, her voice barely audible above the elevator's hum. What she said down there? Later, he replied, his eyes never leaving the monitor displaying Margaret's blood pressure. 90/62. Still critical, but stable enough for surgery, still stable enough to save. The elevator opened onto the surgical floor, and Marcus felt the familiar calm settle over him, the same detachment that had carried him through medical school, through his residency, through every moment of the last 15 years when Thomas Williams's absence had threatened to pull him under. This was his domain, these sterile corridors where precision mattered more than emotion, where technique could triumph over the messiest human complications. As they wheeled Margaret toward Surgery Suite 2, Marcus caught sight of his reflection in the polished steel of a supply cart, the same dark eyes that had watched his father's conviction on a grainy courtroom television, the same hands that had sorted through Thomas Williams's personal effects after the prison beating that took his life 6 months into a 5-year sentence for assault he never committed. Margaret stirred on the gurney, her eyelids fluttering. "I know what you're planning," she mumbled, the words slurred but venomous. "Think you're so smart, but I've got insurance. I've got people who know where I am." Marcus almost smiled at that. Insurance. 3 years of surveillance had shown him exactly how alone Margaret Thornfield had become. No friends visited the diner in Millbrook. No calls came to her apartment except collection agencies and telemarketers. The only person who'd ever mattered to her, the daughter she'd driven away with her bitterness and rage, worked 3 floors below them in pediatric surgery, completely unaware that her estranged mother was about to go under the knife. Sarah. Sweet, brilliant Sarah, who talked in her sleep sometimes, whispering apologies to a mother who'd never hear them, who kept a photo of a younger Margaret hidden in her medical textbooks, believing her own father's lies about why Mommy had to go away. Sarah, who'd been just 12 when Margaret's career in Chicago police security imploded, taking their family down with it. The irony was exquisite in its cruelty. For 3 years, Marcus had dated the daughter of the woman who destroyed his father, and neither woman knew the other existed in his life. Sarah thought her mother had died in a car accident in Michigan. Margaret had no idea her daughter was even alive, let alone thriving despite the emotional wreckage left behind. "Dr. Williams?" The surgical nurse looked up from her prep checklist. "Suite 2 is ready when you are." Marcus nodded, scrubbing his hands with methodical precision. The hot water and antiseptic soap couldn't wash away the weight of what he was about to do, but they could cleanse his hands for the work ahead. Through the observation window, he could see Margaret being transferred to the operating table, her body small and broken under the harsh surgical lights. This wasn't how he'd imagined it would happen. In his fantasies, and there had been many over the years, Margaret would know who he was, would understand exactly why her life hung in the balance. She would face the same helplessness his father had felt in that courtroom, the same terror of knowing that someone else held complete power over your fate. But she already knew. The recognition had been there in the trauma bay, that flash of memory connecting his name to his father's. She knew exactly whose son was about to operate on her, and the knowledge was eating her alive with paranoid fury. Patricia appeared beside him at the scrub station, her movements careful and deliberate. 15 years I've worked with you, she said quietly. Never seen you hesitate before. Marcus paused, his hands dripping with antiseptic. I'm not hesitating. No? Patricia's voice carried decades of experience reading doctors under pressure. Then what would you call it? Through the glass, Margaret's eyes found his, even through the pre-surgical haze. That cold, calculating stare that had probably been the last thing his father saw before she planted the false evidence. The stare of someone who believed the world owed her something, who'd never counted the cost of taking what she wanted. Savoring the moment, Marcus said, and meant it. The surgical lights blazed down like stars as he entered the operating room, ready to save the life of the woman he'd spent 3 years planning to destroy. The scalpel felt like an extension of Marcus's hand as he made the first incision, the blade parting flesh with surgical precision. Margaret's abdomen opened under the harsh lights, revealing the dark pooling of blood that had been slowly killing her for the past hour. Her spleen was worse than the scans had indicated. Not just lacerated, but nearly severed, the torn tissue weeping crimson into her abdominal cavity. Suction, Marcus said, his voice steady as Patricia cleared the blood from his field of vision. Clamp off the splenic artery. This was the moment. One slip of the blade, one accidental nick of the hepatic artery, and Margaret Thornfield would bleed out on his table. It would look like a complication. These things happened, especially in trauma surgery. No one would question it. Patricia might suspect, but she'd never prove anything. The woman who'd sent Thomas Williams to die in a prison cell would simply become another surgical mortality, filed away in some database and forgotten. Marcus positioned the clamp, his hands rock steady despite the voice in his head that sounded remarkably like his father's. Be better than them, son. Be better than the people who think they can play God with other folks' lives. BP dropping, called out the anesthesiologist, 80 over 50 and falling. I see it, Marcus replied, working faster now. His training took over, muscle memory guiding instruments with the precision that had made him one of Chicago's most respected trauma surgeons. Save the patient, always save the patient. Even when the patient was the architect of everything that had gone wrong in his life. The OR doors burst open without warning. Excuse me, Dr. Williams, but we have a situation, came a voice from behind him. Marcus didn't look up from the surgery, but Patricia's sharp intake of breath made his blood turn cold. Not now, Marcus said through gritted teeth. Whatever it is can wait. I'm afraid it can't, sir. The voice belonged to Detective Ray Kowalski from Chicago PD, and suddenly the sterile air of the operating room felt charged with electricity. We received a call about an hour ago, someone claiming to have information about the Thomas Williams case from 15 years ago. Marcus's hand froze over Margaret's exposed organs. The clamp slipped slightly, and a fresh spurt of blood obscured his view. Patricia quickly moved to suction, but her eyes were locked on the detective standing in the doorway of their sterile field. The Williams case was closed years ago, Marcus said, his voice carefully neutral, but his pulse was hammering now, loud enough that he was sure everyone in the room could hear it. That's what we thought too, Detective Kowalski continued. Until tonight. See, we got this anonymous tip, came in about 20 minutes ago from someone claiming to have Thomas Williams's original security recordings. The real ones, before they were altered. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He'd spent years accepting that the evidence against his father would never surface, that Margaret's carefully constructed lies had buried the truth so deep it would never see daylight. The recordings that could have proven Thomas Williams's innocence had supposedly been destroyed in a computer malfunction the day after his arrest. Margaret's blood pressure monitors started alarming, the rapid beeps cutting through the tension in the room like a metronome counting down to disaster. Dr. Williams, Patricia said urgently, we're losing her. Marcus forced himself to focus on the surgery, his hands moving with practiced efficiency even as his world tilted on its axis. 2 units of ONEG now. And get me a vascular clamp, the larger one. The thing is, Detective Kowalski pressed on, apparently oblivious to the life-or-death drama playing out on the operating table. This tipster seemed to know an awful lot about tonight's surgery. Knew the patient's name, knew you were the attending physician, almost like someone wanted us to be here for this exact moment. Marcus's blood turned to ice water in his veins. Someone else was playing this game, Someone who knew about Margaret, about him, about the connection that bound them together in blood and vengeance. But who and why now? The recordings, Marcus said, his voice barely audible above the surgical equipment. What do they show? Haven't seen them yet. They're being delivered as we speak. But if they're legitimate, if they show what this tipster claims. Detective Kowalski's voice trailed off meaningfully. Well, let's just say Margaret Thornfield might have some explaining to do. Assuming she survives, of course. Patricia's eyes met Marcus's across the operating table, and he could see the question there, the doubt that hadn't existed an hour ago. Did she think he would let Margaret die now? Did she think 15 years of medical ethics would crumble under the weight of this revelation? The truth was, Marcus didn't know. As he worked to repair the damage to Margaret's abdomen, his hands guided by instinct and training, his mind raced through possibilities he'd never dared consider. Justice. Real justice, not the crude revenge he'd been planning. Margaret Thornfield might survive this surgery only to face the reckoning that had been 15 years in the coming. But first, he had to keep her alive long enough to see it. The silence stretched across the operating room like a taut wire, broken only by the rhythmic beeping of Margaret's monitors and the soft hiss of the ventilator. Marcus's hands continued their precise work, removing Margaret's damaged spleen, while his mind reeled from Detective Kowalski's revelation. Someone else knew. Someone else was orchestrating this moment, and that terrified him more than any surgical complication ever could. Doctor? Patricia's voice carried a tremor he'd never heard before. She was staring at the detective, her face pale above her surgical mask. Should we continue? Marcus didn't answer immediately. His fingers worked to tie off blood vessels with the mechanical precision of 15 years' practice. But Patricia's question hung in the sterile air like an accusation. The woman who destroyed his father lay open on his table, her life literally in his hands, and now the police were talking about evidence that could prove what Marcus had always known, that Thomas Williams had been innocent. The surgery continues, he said finally, his voice steady despite the chaos in his chest, until the patient is stable. Detective Kowalski shifted uncomfortably in the doorway, clearly unused to the strange intimacy of an operating room. Dr. Williams, I have to ask, did you know who your patient was when you began the procedure? The question struck Marcus like a scalpel to the heart. Patricia's eyes widened above her mask, and he could see her connecting dots she'd been trying to ignore. The name recognition, Margaret's paranoid accusations, the way Marcus's hands had trembled, just for a moment, when she'd mentioned Thomas Williams. I know now, Marcus replied, which was the truth, even if it wasn't the whole truth. He'd known the moment he'd seen her name on the trauma board 3 hours ago. He'd known when he'd specifically requested to be her attending physician. He'd known since the day he'd tracked her down to that pathetic diner in Millbrook, and begun planning this moment with the patience of someone who'd learned to live with grief. The OR doors whispered open again, and Marcus felt his world tilt further off its axis. Sarah Thornfield stepped inside, her pediatric surgery scrubs pristine, her dark hair pulled back in the neat bun she always wore during her overnight shifts. She looked tired but beautiful, the way she always did at 3 in the morning when she'd stolen a few minutes to check on him between surgeries. Hey, I heard you caught a bad trauma case, Sarah said, moving toward the table with the easy confidence of someone who belonged in operating rooms. Thought I'd see if you needed... Her words died as her eyes fell on the patient's face. Marcus watched in horrible slow motion as recognition dawned across Sarah's features. The color drained from her cheeks and her hand flew to her mouth as if to hold back a scream. Margaret Thornfield, older, grayer, marked by years of small-town bitterness, but unmistakably the mother Sarah thought was dead. Oh God, Sarah whispered, the words barely audible through her fingers. Oh my God, that's... Patricia moved instinctively toward Sarah, reaching out to steady her, but Sarah stumbled backward toward the wall. Marcus wanted to go to her, wanted to explain, wanted to do anything except stand frozen with his hands inside the abdomen of the woman who connected them all in this nightmare web of secrets and lies. Sarah? Detective Kowalski looked between them with the sharp interest of someone trained to notice reactions. Do you know this patient? Sarah's laugh was broken, hysterical. Know her? She's my mother. My mother who's supposed to be dead. Her eyes found Marcus across the table, and he could see the questions forming, the pieces clicking together in her brilliant mind. Marcus, how long have you known? The monitors chose that moment to alarm again. Margaret's blood pressure was dropping, her heart rate climbing into dangerous territory. The stress of the surgery, combined with blood loss, was pushing her body toward shock. "We need to focus," Marcus said, though his own voice sounded far away. "Everyone who doesn't need to be here, out. Now." But nobody moved. Sarah stood pressed against the wall, staring at her mother's unconscious form with an expression of such raw pain that Marcus felt it like a physical blow. Detective Kowalski remained in the doorway, his presence a reminder that this was now a crime scene as much as it was a surgery. Patricia stood frozen between professional duty and personal confusion, looking like she was watching her orderly world crumble in real time. And Margaret lay dying on the table while her daughter and the son of the man she'd destroyed faced each other across her broken body, the weight of 15 years of lies and manipulation finally coming to light. The universe, Marcus thought with bitter clarity, had a twisted sense of poetic justice. His hands moved to stem another bleed, fighting to save the woman whose survival might finally destroy them all. The silence that followed Sarah's question felt like a held breath, stretching until Marcus thought something in the room might snap from the tension. Margaret's monitors continued their urgent chorus, but nobody moved. Patricia's hands hovered over her surgical instruments. Detective Kowalski shifted his weight in the doorway, and Sarah pressed herself against the wall as if trying to disappear into it entirely. Marcus's fingers worked automatically, applying pressure to slow Margaret's bleeding, but his mind was fragmenting. 3 years. 3 years of waking up next to Sarah, of listening to her whisper about the mother she'd lost, of holding her while she cried on the anniversary of what she thought was Margaret's death. 3 years of planning his revenge against a woman who turned out to be the most important person in Sarah's world. "Marcus!" Sarah's voice was stronger now, cutting through his paralysis. "How long have you known?" He looked up from the surgery, meeting her eyes across their shared catastrophe. Sarah's face was pale but determined, her physician's training warring with her emotional devastation. She deserved the truth. She deserved so much more than the truth. "Since before I met you," he said quietly. The words landed like a physical blow. Sarah's hand found the wall behind her, gripping it for support. "Before you met me." She repeated it like she was testing the weight of each syllable. "You knew she was alive and you let me." God, Marcus, I mourned her. For 15 years I mourned her. Patricia's surgical mask couldn't hide her growing horror as she processed the implications. "Dr. Williams, are you saying this surgery was planned?" Detective Kowalski finished, his voice sharp with professional suspicion. "Dr. Williams, I need you to very carefully explain your relationship to this patient." Margaret chose that moment to crash. Her blood pressure plummeted to 60/30, and the cardiac monitor erupted into chaos. Marcus's training slammed him back into the moment with brutal clarity. Whatever else Margaret Thornfield was, architect of his father's destruction, source of Sarah's lifelong grief, object of 15 years of careful rage, she was dying on his table. "She's going into shock," he called out, his hands moving with desperate precision. "Patricia, I need those clamps now, and push another unit of blood." But Patricia hesitated, her eyes darting between Marcus and the monitors. "Doctor, should I call for backup? Maybe Dr. Rodriguez should." "There's no time." Marcus's voice carried 15 years of surgical authority, cutting through her doubt. "She'll bleed out before anyone else can scrub in." Sarah stepped away from the wall, her movements suddenly purposeful. "What do you need?" "Sarah, no," Marcus said sharply. "You shouldn't be here for this. She's my mother." The words came out fierce, raw. "Whatever else she is, whatever she's done, she's my mother, and she's dying. Tell me what you need." Detective Kowalski moved closer, his hand resting on his radio. "I'm going to need everyone to stay exactly where they are until we can sort this out. Dr. Williams, those recordings I mentioned, they just arrived." Marcus's hands stilled for a fraction of a second before resuming their work. The recordings. Thomas Williams's voice, probably, explaining what really happened that night at Mercy General. His father's last testimony, delivered 15 years too late to save him, but possibly just in time to destroy the woman who'd killed him. "What do they show?" Sarah asked, her voice hollow. "Security footage from the night your mother accused Thomas Williams of assault. Footage that shows her planting evidence in his locker, doctoring the incident reports." Detective Kowalski's voice was matter of fact, but Marcus could hear the satisfaction underneath. Your mother didn't just ruin an innocent man's life, Dr. Thornfield. She murdered him. Thomas Williams died in prison 6 months after his conviction. The color drained from Sarah's face completely. She looked at Marcus with dawning understanding, and he saw the moment she made the connection. Williams, Thomas Williams, the father he'd mentioned losing, the reason he'd gone into trauma surgery, the ghost that haunted their relationship in ways she'd never understood. Your father, she whispered. Margaret's monitors screamed louder, demanding attention that Marcus couldn't give. He was drowning in the weight of revelation, in the collision of past and present that was destroying everything he'd built. Sarah knew now. She knew he was the son of the man her mother had killed, knew their entire relationship had been built on a lie, knew he'd let her grieve for a woman who was not only alive but guilty of murder. Save her, Sarah said suddenly, her voice breaking. Marcus, please. Whatever she did, whatever this means for us, save her. I need to know why. I need to understand what happened to our family. Marcus's hands trembled as he reached for the vascular clamps, fighting to repair damage that went so much deeper than torn tissue and severed arteries. In trying to destroy Margaret Thornfield, he'd destroyed the only good thing that had come from his father's death, his love for Sarah. The monitors shrieked their electronic prayer for a woman whose survival might be the cruelest justice of all. Marcus's hands moved with mechanical precision, clamping the severed artery while his world collapsed around him. Sarah's plea echoed in his mind, save her, but all he could hear was the deeper truth hidden beneath those words. Sarah still loved the woman who had murdered his father. Even knowing what Margaret had done, even understanding the web of lies that had shaped their lives, Sarah's instinct was to protect the mother she thought was dead. The revelation should have clarified everything. Instead, it made Marcus realize how completely he'd been lying to himself. For 3 years, he'd told himself that finding Sarah had been an accident, a beautiful coincidence that had nothing to do with his larger plan for Margaret Thornfield. He'd met her at a medical conference, been drawn to her brilliance and compassion, fallen in love with her dedication to pediatric surgery. The fact that she was Margaret's daughter had been a complication he'd chosen to ignore, not the reason he'd pursued her. But as he worked to save Margaret's life while Sarah watched with desperate hope, Marcus felt the comfortable fiction crumble. He hadn't fallen in love despite Sarah being Margaret's daughter. He'd fallen in love because of it. Some twisted part of him had been seduced by the symmetry, the son of the destroyed man finding love with the daughter of his destroyer. It had felt like justice of a kind, taking something precious from Margaret even if she'd never known she'd lost it. BP stabilizing, Patricia reported, her voice carefully professional. 80 over 50 and climbing. Good, Marcus replied automatically, but his focus was fracturing. Across the table, Sarah stood vigil over her mother's unconscious form, her face a mask of anguish that Marcus had put there. The woman he loved was suffering because he'd orchestrated this moment, because he'd been too proud and too damaged to let go of his father's ghost. Detective Kowalski stepped closer to the table, his radio crackling with updates from the station. The recordings are being authenticated now, but preliminary review confirms what we suspected. Your mother systematically framed Thomas Williams, Dr. Thornfield. The evidence shows she planted drug paraphernalia in his locker, falsified incident reports, and coerced witness statements. Sarah's breath hitched, but she didn't look away from Margaret. Why? She whispered. Why would she destroy an innocent man? It was the question Marcus had been asking for 15 years, the question that had driven him to track Margaret to her small-town exile, that had consumed him through medical school and residency and the careful construction of his new life. But now, watching Sarah's pain, he realized the answer didn't matter anymore. Nothing Margaret had done could justify what he was doing to her daughter. Dr. Williams, Detective Kowalski continued, I need to understand your role in tonight's events. The anonymous tip that brought us here, it came from someone who knew you'd be operating on Margaret Thornfield, someone who wanted us to witness this moment. The accusation hung in the sterile air like a challenge. Patricia's hands stilled on her instruments, and Sarah's eyes found Marcus across the operating table. He could see her putting it together. The too convenient timing, the way he'd known Margaret's identity, the careful orchestration that had brought them all to this moment. You, Sarah said, her voice barely audible, you called them. You've been planning this. Marcus wanted to deny it, wanted to find words that could somehow explain away the truth. But looking at Sarah's face, the betrayal there, the growing understanding of how deeply he'd manipulated her life, he realized that lies had brought them here. More lies wouldn't lead them out. I wanted justice, he said simply. For my father. For what she took from him. So you took something from me. Sarah's voice was gaining strength, anger burning through her grief. You took 3 years of my life. You let me love you while you planned to destroy my mother. You let me tell you about the nightmares, about how much I missed her, about the guilt I carried thinking she'd killed herself because of our fight. The fight. Marcus had heard about it dozens of times during their relationship. Sarah's last conversation with her mother, a bitter argument about Sarah's decision to pursue medicine instead of following Margaret's path in security. Sarah had been carrying that guilt for 15 years, believing her rejection had driven Margaret to suicide. Another lie, another manipulation. Even in her supposed death, Margaret had found a way to wound her daughter. She faked her death to escape, Marcus realized aloud. When the Williams case started attracting attention, when someone began asking questions, she abandoned you to save herself. Sarah's laugh was bitter, broken. And you abandoned me to destroy her. She looked down at Margaret's unconscious face, then back at Marcus. You're both exactly the same. You both used me to get what you wanted. The accusation hit Marcus harder than any physical blow could have, because Sarah was right. In his obsession with justice for his father, he'd become exactly what he'd sworn to fight against. Someone who treated other people as means to an end, who justified cruelty with righteousness. Margaret's monitor suddenly stabilized, her vital signs climbing back into acceptable ranges. The surgery had worked. She would live. Marcus stepped back from the table, pulling off his bloodied gloves, and finally understood the cruel joke the universe had played on all of them. He'd spent 15 years planning his revenge against Margaret Thornfield, only to discover that the greatest damage had already been done, not to her, but to the innocent daughter whose love had been the only good thing to come from this entire nightmare. The surgical suite fell into an eerie quiet after Margaret's monitors stabilized, broken only by the soft hiss of the ventilator and the distant sounds of the hospital's night shift. Marcus stood with his bloodied gloves in his hands, staring at the woman whose survival felt like a mockery of everything he'd sacrificed to reach this moment. 15 years of planning, 3 years of lying to the person he loved most, and Margaret Thornfield would walk out of this hospital alive while his relationship with Sarah lay dying on the operating table. Sarah hadn't moved from her position against the wall, her eyes fixed on her mother's face with an intensity that made Marcus's chest ache. He could see her mind working, processing revelations that were reshaping her understanding of her entire adult life. The mother she'd mourned was a murderer. The man she'd loved was her mother's victim's son. The life she'd built was constructed on lies within lies within lies. The surgery's complete, Patricia announced unnecessarily, her voice tight with professional confusion. She began cleaning instruments with mechanical precision, clearly desperate for something normal to focus on while her world tilted sideways. Patient stable for transport to recovery. Detective Kowalski stepped forward, his radio crackling with updates from the precinct. Authentication's complete on those recordings, Dr. Williams. Crystal clear footage of your mother planting evidence, he said to Sarah, his voice gentler now that he understood the family dynamics at play. The DA's office is reviewing charges, but given the statute of limitations and the victim's death, he shrugged. Justice isn't always legal justice. The words hung heavy in the air. Thomas Williams was dead. Margaret had escaped legal consequences for 15 years and might escape them permanently. The only justice available was the personal kind, the kind Marcus had been planning in the dark corners of his heart since he was 23 years old and watching his father's casket disappear into the ground. But looking at Sarah's devastated face, Marcus realized that personal justice was just another word for revenge, and revenge had a way of consuming everything good in its path. I need to know something, Sarah said suddenly, her voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel. She looked directly at Marcus, her dark eyes holding none of the warmth he'd grown accustomed to over 3 years of shared mornings and whispered conversations. When you met me at the trauma conference in Boston, was that real? Any of it? The question Marcus had been dreading since the moment Sarah walked into the OR. The question that would determine whether anything salvageable remained of what they'd built together, or whether his obsession with Margaret had poisoned even their genuine moments. He could lie, tell her the conference meeting was coincidence, that he'd fallen in love before learning who she was. The lie would be kind, might even be believable. But standing in the wreckage of everything he'd destroyed pursuing his father's ghost, Marcus found he had no taste left for comfortable fictions. "I knew who you were," he said quietly. "I'd been tracking your mother for 2 years by then. I knew she had a daughter in pediatric surgery. I knew you'd be at that conference." Sarah's face went perfectly still, but he could see the impact in the way her breathing changed, becoming shallow and controlled. "So when you asked me to dinner, when you said you were impressed by my presentation on pediatric trauma protocols, when you—" She stopped, pressing her hand to her mouth as if the words might physically wound her. "When I told you I loved you 6 months later," Marcus finished for her, hating himself with each word. "When I moved in with you, when we talked about marriage, about building a life together, all of it was built on knowing who you were." "Built on using who I was," Sarah corrected, her voice gaining strength through her anger. "God, Marcus, did you plan our entire relationship? Was every moment calculated to get closer to her?" The accusation should have been easy to deny, but Marcus found himself examining their 3 years together with brutal honesty. How many times had he steered conversations toward Sarah's family history? How often had he encouraged her to talk about the mother she thought was dead, gathering intelligence while pretending to provide comfort? How much of their intimacy had been genuine, and how much had been reconnaissance? "I don't know," he admitted, the words tasting like ash. "I told myself I loved you despite who your mother was. But Sarah—" He stepped toward her, desperate to bridge the growing chasm between them. "Whatever brought us together, what I feel for you is real. What we built is real." "No." Sarah backed away from him, her voice breaking. "What we built is a lie. Everything we built is a lie." She looked down at Margaret, unconscious form, then back at Marcus with something like pity. "You destroyed your own life chasing revenge against her, and you destroyed mine in the process." The truth of it hit Marcus like a physical blow, because Sarah was right. In his quest to destroy Margaret Thornfield, he'd become someone capable of using love as a weapon, someone who could rationalize betraying the person who mattered most to him. He'd won his revenge and lost his soul in the process. Margaret's eyelids fluttered, consciousness beginning to return just as everything else fell apart. Margaret's eyes opened slowly, her consciousness emerging from the anesthetic haze like a drowning person breaking the surface. Her gaze found Marcus first, then tracked to Detective Kowalski, then to the familiar stranger standing against the wall, the woman whose face carried echoes of her own features, aged by 15 years of grief Margaret had never allowed herself to imagine. "Sarah," she whispered, the name emerging as both prayer and curse. Sarah moved closer to the bed, her steps careful and deliberate. "Hello, Mother." The word hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Margaret's eyes filled with tears she hadn't shed since the night she'd staged her own death, leaving her daughter to believe she'd chosen suicide over facing her mistakes. "You're supposed to be dead," Margaret said, her voice gaining strength as the anesthetic wore off. "I made sure. The note, the timing." "You made sure I'd blame myself," Sarah corrected, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. "You made sure I'd carry that guilt for 15 years. You made sure I'd believe our last fight drove you to kill yourself." Marcus watched the reunion he'd orchestrated, feeling like a voyeur at his own crime scene. This moment, mother and daughter confronting 15 years of manufactured grief, this was what his revenge had bought him, the destruction of 2 innocent lives to balance the scales for his father's murder. Margaret struggled to sit up, her surgeon's instincts cataloging the signs of successful surgery even as her world collapsed around her. "How did you find me? After all this time, how—" Her eyes found Marcus again, and he saw the moment recognition clicked into place. "Williams. Dr. Thomas Williams." She looked between Marcus and Sarah, understanding dawning with cruel clarity. "Oh God, what have I done?" "You killed an innocent man," Detective Kowalski said matter-of-factly. "We have the recordings, Mrs. Thornfield, every detail of how you framed Thomas Williams, planted evidence, coerced witnesses. We know what you did." But Margaret wasn't looking at the detective anymore. Her attention was fixed on Sarah with desperate intensity, as if she could somehow communicate 15 years of regret through eye contact alone. "I never meant for you to get hurt. Everything I did to protect—" "To protect yourself," Sarah cut her off. "You protected yourself and left me to grieve a mother who never had the courage to face what she'd done." Margaret flinched as if she'd been slapped. "You're right. I was a coward. I am a coward." She looked at Marcus, her voice growing stronger. "But your father, he wasn't innocent, Dr. Williams. Not entirely." The words hit the room like a physical force. Marcus stepped closer to the bed, his hands clenching into fists. Don't you dare try to justify what you did to him. I'm not justifying anything, Margaret said, her security chief's authority reasserting itself despite her physical weakness. What I did was wrong, unforgivable. But your father was dealing drugs in the hospital, Dr. Williams. Not to patients, to staff, night shift orderlies mostly. People struggling to make ends meet on hospital wages. The revelation struck Marcus like a blow to the chest. His father, the man he'd idealized for 15 years, the innocent victim whose memory had driven him to destroy his own capacity for love, a drug dealer. That doesn't justify framing him for assault, Sarah said quietly, but Marcus could hear the shift in her voice. The world was more complicated than any of them had wanted to believe. No, it doesn't, Margaret agreed. But when I caught him, when I confronted him about it, he attacked me. Not sexually, I made that up. But he did attack me, grabbed me, shoved me against the wall, threatened to destroy my career if I reported him. She looked at Marcus with something like compassion. I panicked. Instead of reporting what actually happened, I created a story I thought would be easier to prove. I turned an assault into a sexual assault, planted drugs to make him look unstable. I destroyed an innocent man to cover up my inability to handle a guilty one. The surgical suite fell silent except for the quiet beeping of monitors and the soft hiss of oxygen. Marcus felt 15 years of carefully constructed narrative crumble around him. His father hadn't been innocent. Margaret hadn't been purely evil. The clear lines between justice and revenge, victim and perpetrator, love and manipulation, all of it was dissolving into shades of gray that offered no comfort to anyone. Sarah was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. None of it matters. What he did, what she did, what you did, none of it justifies the lies, the manipulation, the years of grief I carried believing I'd killed my own mother with cruel words. She looked at both of them with equal measures of love and disgust. You're both broken people who broke everyone around you trying to fix yourselves, and now we're all just broken together. Margaret reached toward her daughter with trembling fingers. Sarah, please. No. Sarah stepped back, her decision crystallizing with devastating finality. I'm done. I'm done with both of you. The finality in Sarah's voice echoed through the surgical suite like a death knell. She walked to the scrub sink, methodically washing her hands as if she could cleanse herself of everything that had transpired, then disappeared through the doors without looking back. The soft whoosh of the pneumatic hinges marked the end of something that could never be repaired. Margaret closed her eyes, her face crumpling with a grief that 15 years of self-imposed exile had never allowed her to process. She's right, she whispered to the ceiling. We are all just broken. Detective Kowalski cleared his throat, the sound harsh in the sudden quiet. Mrs. Thornfield, you'll need to come in for questioning once you're discharged. The DA will decide about charges, but given the statute of limitations... He shrugged, leaving the sentence unfinished. Just as it seemed had an expiration date. Marcus stood alone beside the gurney as they wheeled Margaret away, still wearing his surgical scrubs, still covered in the blood of the woman whose life he'd saved while destroying his own. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent 15 years planning this moment, and now he couldn't remember why it had mattered so much. 3 months later, Marcus found himself sitting in the same diner where Margaret had spent her exile, stirring cold coffee and staring out at the empty streets of Millbrook. The locals still whispered about the night their quiet baker had been revealed as a fugitive, though most seemed more fascinated than scandalized. Small towns, Marcus had learned, were surprisingly comfortable with complicated truths. Margaret had returned here after her discharge, not because she had anywhere else to go, but because she'd discovered that running only worked until you ran out of road. The charges against her had been dropped. Too much time, too little evidence, a victim who couldn't testify to his version of events. Legal justice had proven as elusive as every other kind. You don't have to keep coming here, she said, sliding into the booth across from him. At 63, she looked older than her years, her face carrying the weight of consequences finally acknowledged. Sarah made her choice. You tormenting yourself won't change it. Marcus had been making this drive from Chicago every weekend, though he couldn't have explained why. Not for Margaret. He felt no forgiveness for her, no desire for friendship. Perhaps it was penance, or perhaps it was simply the only place left where the truth lived unvarnished. She changed her name, he said, not looking up from his coffee. Dr. Sarah Chen now. Took her stepfather's surname. She's doing pediatric trauma surgery in Portland. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she poured herself coffee from the pot she'd brought over. You're still keeping track of her. I'm still in love with her. The admission tasted like defeat. 3 years of lies, and I'm still in love with the person I destroyed. They sat in silence, two broken people sharing the weight of irrevocable choices. Outside, the afternoon light was fading, casting long shadows across the empty parking lot. Margaret had always found this time of day the hardest, the moment when day surrendered to night, when the illusion of forward momentum gave way to the truth that some things never changed. Your father, she said finally. He had a picture in his locker. You and your mother at your high school graduation. He was proud of you. Marcus looked up, something raw and unguarded flickering across his face. Why are you telling me this? Because I robbed you of 15 years of complicated grief. Made you think he was a saint when he was just a man who made bad choices and paid a price that didn't fit the crime. Margaret's voice was steady, matter of fact. You deserve to mourn him properly, not worship a memory I helped create. The truth of it settled between them like a final accounting. His father had been flawed, Margaret had been both victim and perpetrator, and Marcus had sacrificed his future to avenge a past that was messier than he'd ever allowed himself to believe. What do we do now? He asked. Margaret smiled for the first time since he'd known her, and it was sad and knowing and surprisingly gentle. We live with what we've done. We try to be better than we were. We accept that some breaks don't heal. As evening fell over Millbrook, Marcus drove back toward Chicago, past the billboard welcoming visitors to their small town, past the exit where Sarah had once planned to visit her mother's grave. In his rearview mirror, he could see the lights of Margaret's diner growing smaller, a small beacon in an ocean of darkness. He would keep making this drive, he realized, not for forgiveness or closure or any hope of redemption, but because some stories didn't end with resolution, they ended with the simple commitment to keep living inside the consequences of who you'd chosen to become.